My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old. Last Christmas, my husband surprised his mother with a brand new house. Everyone stood up and applauded. His mother burst into tears. His sister wrapped him in the longest hug I'd ever seen. Even the neighbors who had been invited for dinner started clapping. Mark smiled like he'd just changed someone's life. "I've been planning this for almost a year," he said proudly. "You deserve it, Mom." She looked at him with tears running down her cheeks. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just be happy." I smiled too. I hugged my mother-in-law. I told her how happy I was for her. And I truly meant it. She had spent years living in an old house that constantly needed repairs. The roof leaked every winter. The plumbing barely worked. She deserved something better. So did I, except 3 weeks later. My husband sat me down at our kitchen table. He looked unusually calm, almost rehearsed. "We need to talk about the house." I thought he meant his mother's new place. Instead, he looked straight at me and said, "I think it's time we sell yours." For a few seconds, I honestly thought he was joking. "My house?" "Our house," he corrected. I looked around the kitchen, the white cabinets, the old oak table my grandfather built, the window over the sink. Everything around me had been part of my family long before Mark and I ever met. "No," I said quietly. "I mean my house." He leaned back in his chair. "You know what I mean." Actually, I didn't. Because that house had never belonged to him. My grandmother left it to me when I was 26. She had raised me after my parents died in a car accident. Every birthday, every Christmas, every memory I had left of my family lived inside those walls. When Grandma passed away, she left me one thing. That house, nothing else, no fortune, no investment accounts. Just a modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood outside Chicago. When Mark and I got married 4 years later, he moved in, not the other way around. I never asked him to pay rent. I never asked him to buy half the house. I thought marriage meant building one life together, and for years, I believed we were. I worked as a financial analyst. He owned a small construction company. Between us, we made a comfortable living. At least, that's what I thought. Then he cleared his throat. My mother's house cost more than I expected. I stayed quiet. The bank approved most of the mortgage. Another pause. But I had to use almost all my savings for the down payment. I still didn't understand where this conversation was going. "So? We're stretched pretty thin," I nodded. "Okay. We'll cut back on spending." He shook his head. "It's not enough." Then he said the sentence that changed everything. "If we sell your house, we can pay off Mom's mortgage completely." I stared at him, waiting for him to smile, waiting for him to admit this was some terrible joke. He never did. Instead, he reached into a folder lying beside him. He pulled out several printed papers, real estate estimates, comparable home sales, potential listing prices. He had already done the math, without telling me, without asking me, without even wondering whether I wanted to keep the only thing my grandmother had ever left me. I slowly pushed the papers back across the table. "I'm not selling my house." His face didn't change. "You haven't even looked." "I don't need to. It makes financial sense." "No. It would help everyone." "No," he sighed. "You've always been emotional about that place." Emotional. That word hit me harder than anything else he'd said. Because to him, it wasn't my childhood. It wasn't my grandmother. It wasn't my family. It was simply an asset. One he believed could be traded away. And that was the moment I realized. We weren't having the same conversation anymore. The next morning, Mark acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed me goodbye before leaving for work. He even texted me around noon. "Don't forget dinner at Mom's tonight." Nothing about the house. Nothing about the argument. For a moment, I wondered if he'd changed his mind. He hadn't. The moment we sat down at his mother's dining table, I realized the conversation had already moved beyond the two of us. His mother smiled warmly as she poured coffee. "I've been thinking about what Mark told me." I looked at him. He avoided my eyes. "What exactly did Mark tell you?" I asked. She laughed softly. "That you're nervous about selling the house." My stomach dropped. I hadn't even agreed to discuss it. Yet somehow, everyone else already knew. His younger sister, Melissa, leaned forward. I actually think it's a smart idea. I didn't answer. She continued anyway. It's just a house. No, it wasn't. His mother reached across the table and touched my hand. Emily, I know you're attached to it, but families make sacrifices. There it was, that word, sacrifice. Funny how the person asking for the sacrifice is almost never the one making it. I smiled politely. I've already made my decision. Silence. Mark put his fork down. You haven't really thought about it. I have. You only said no because you were surprised. I said no because I meant it. Melissa rolled her eyes. I don't understand why you're being so selfish. Selfish. That was new. I looked around the table. 3 people, 3 opinions. Not one person asked how I felt. Not one person asked what that house meant to me. To them, it had already become money, nothing more. His mother sighed dramatically. I never wanted this to create problems. Then she looked directly at me. I'd never ask if it weren't absolutely necessary. I couldn't help asking, necessary for what? She looked confused. For my future. I glanced toward Mark. Didn't you tell me the mortgage was approved? He shifted in his chair. It was. So why is everyone acting like you'll lose the house? No one answered. Instead, Melissa quickly changed the subject. The rest of dinner felt painfully forced. Everyone laughed. Everyone talked. Except me. On the drive home, I finally broke the silence. You told your family before talking to me. I needed advice. You needed permission. They're my family. So am I. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. You're making this much harder than it needs to be. No, you did that. He didn't say another word. The next week, strange little things started happening. Every evening, Mark would leave brochures on the kitchen counter. New houses, smaller houses, condominiums. Just ideas, he'd say. One afternoon, I came home to find a real estate agent standing in my living room. She smiled when she saw me. You must be Emily. I've heard wonderful things about this property. I turned toward Mark. What is she doing here? He looked genuinely confused. I thought she'd just give us an estimate. Us? The agent awkwardly closed her folder. I can come back another time. Yes, I said firmly. You can. She left within seconds. The front door hadn't even closed before I looked at my husband. You invited a realtor into my house without asking me. I thought once you saw the numbers, you thought money would change my answer. He rubbed his forehead. I don't understand why you're refusing to even consider it. Because this isn't an investment. It is. No, it's my home. For the first time since we'd been married, I saw frustration turn into anger. You always act like everything your grandmother touched is sacred. I froze. He immediately realized what he'd said, but it was too late. Some words don't disappear after they're spoken. They stay, echoing long after the room goes quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through every room in the house, the hallway where Grandma measured my height every birthday, the kitchen where she taught me to bake cinnamon rolls, the porch where we'd sit every summer evening watching thunderstorms roll across the sky. I suddenly realized something. If I sold this house, I wouldn't just lose a building. I'd lose the last place where I could still feel her. And for the first time, a question crossed my mind that terrified me. Why was my husband fighting so hard for something that had never belonged to him? The next morning, I called in sick. Not because I was ill, because I couldn't stop thinking about one question. Why was Mark in such a hurry? If his mother's mortgage had already been approved, why did he suddenly need my house? Nothing made sense anymore. Around 10 o'clock, I opened my laptop. As a financial analyst, numbers had always been easier for me than people. Numbers don't lie. People do. I logged into our joint budget spreadsheet. We'd always kept our finances mostly separate. We split household expenses. Each paid our own personal bills. It had worked for years. Or at least, I thought it had. Something immediately caught my attention. Large transfers. Several of them. Thousands of dollars. All sent from Mark's business account to another account I didn't recognize. I frowned. Construction companies often move money around for suppliers. Maybe that was all it was, but something still felt wrong. I opened the company records. The recipient wasn't a supplier. It wasn't a contractor. It wasn't a materials company. It was a luxury car dealership. I blinked. Twice. Mark had told me business had slowed down. He'd said cash flow was tight. He'd said buying his mother's house had drained almost everything. Then why? Had he wired nearly $80,000 to a dealership 2 months earlier? I searched a little further. Another payment. Private marina membership. Then another. A luxury golf club. None of it matched the picture he'd painted for me. Not even close. I leaned back in my chair. Either my husband was hiding money, or he was hiding debt. Neither option was good. That afternoon, I decided not to confront him. Not yet. Instead, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. David, Mark's former accountant. He'd retired 6 months earlier. We'd always gotten along well. When I asked if we could meet for coffee, he sounded surprised. But he agreed. An hour later, we sat in a quiet cafe downtown. After a few minutes of small talk, I asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Was Mark's company really struggling? David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stirred his coffee, then looked directly at me. "Why are you asking?" "Because something doesn't add up," he sighed. "I can't discuss his business." "I know. I'm not asking for confidential information. I'm asking if my husband has been honest with me." David was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Emily, there were months when business slowed. That happens. But bankruptcy?" He shook his head. "Never." My heart sank. So he wasn't desperate? No. He made several very expensive personal decisions. I felt my stomach tighten. What kind of decisions? "I'm sorry. I really shouldn't say more. That was enough. I didn't need details anymore. I already knew. The problem wasn't money. The problem was priorities." When I got home that evening, Mark was in an unusually good mood. "I've got great news." I forced a smile. "What is it?" He pulled a folder from his briefcase. "I found a buyer." I stared at him. "A buyer for what?" He smiled. "The house." I felt every muscle in my body freeze. "You... what?" "They're willing to pay above market value." "I haven't agreed to sell." "They're serious buyers." I said no. He sighed like I was being unreasonable. I didn't sign anything. I just wanted to move things along. Move things along. As if selling the house where my grandmother raised me was the same as trading in an old car. I slowly stood up. My voice stayed calm. "Mark, if you ever bring another buyer to this house, without my permission, our conversation won't be about real estate anymore." For the first time, he looked uncomfortable, not guilty. Uncomfortable, because he realized something. For the first time since we'd met, I wasn't giving in, and he had absolutely no idea what I had already discovered. And that night, I barely slept. Not because I was angry, because I couldn't stop asking myself one question. If Mark wasn't broke, why did he need my house so badly? The answer came 2 days later, by accident. Friday afternoon, I left work early. One of my meetings had been canceled, so I decided to surprise Mark with lunch. His office wasn't far from downtown. I picked up sandwiches from his favorite deli and drove over. His truck wasn't outside. Neither was anyone else's. The office looked empty. I was about to leave when I heard voices coming from the conference room. The door wasn't completely closed. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But then I heard my name. "Emily still doesn't know." It was a man's voice. Mark answered. "Not yet. I'll tell her after the closing." Closing? My heart started pounding. Another voice spoke. "You really think she'll agree?" Mark laughed. "I don't need her to agree. By the time she finds out, it'll already be done." I felt every drop of blood leave my face. Done? What would already be done? The first man lowered his voice. "I still think buying that commercial property is risky." Mark replied without hesitation. "It'll triple in value once the new highway is finished." Commercial property, I frowned. This wasn't about his mother anymore, not even close. He continued. "I just need enough cash to close the deal. And Emily's house solves that problem." I couldn't breathe. The house was never about helping his mother. It was collateral. My grandmother's house had become his investment plan, without my knowledge, without my permission. I quietly stepped away before anyone saw me. I got back into my car, closed the door, and sat there for almost 15 minutes, not crying, not yelling, just staring through the windshield. Everything suddenly made sense. The expensive house for his mother, the pressure, the realtor, the buyers, the brochures. None of it had anything to do with family. He wasn't trying to save anyone. He was trying to build an empire, using something that wasn't his. That evening, I said nothing. I cooked dinner. We watched television. He talked about work. I smiled when I was supposed to. For the first time since we'd met, I lied to him, just like he'd been lying to me. Saturday morning, while Mark was playing golf with clients, I drove to the county recorder's office. I wanted copies of every document connected to my house. The clerk printed everything within minutes. Property deed, tax records, transfer history. Nothing unusual until she looked at one document and frowned. "That's odd." "What is?" She turned the paper toward me. "This authorization request was submitted last week." I looked down. There it was, my address, my legal name. A request related to refinancing documentation. I frowned. "I never submitted this." The clerk looked surprised. "It says it was initiated electronically." My stomach twisted. Someone had already started paperwork involving my house, without telling me, without my signature. I looked at the date, 3 days after Mark first asked me to sell. I thanked the clerk, took the copies, and walked back to my car. This wasn't just pressure anymore. This wasn't just manipulation. Someone had already begun treating my house as if it belonged to them. I looked down at the stack of papers in my lap. Then I picked up my phone. There was only one person I wanted to call, not my husband, a lawyer. I met with the attorney on Monday morning. Her name was Rebecca Collins. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she closed her notebook. "First," she said, "your husband cannot sell your house without your signature." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "But," she paused, "if he has already used your property in conversations with investors or lenders, that's a different issue." I slid the paperwork across her desk. "And this?" She adjusted her glasses. "This looks like the beginning of a financing inquiry. It doesn't transfer ownership. But someone clearly intended to move forward." I nodded slowly. "So what do I do?" Rebecca smiled. "Nothing." I frowned. "What?" "Let him believe you know nothing." That wasn't the answer I expected. She leaned forward. People usually reveal much more when they think they're winning. For the next 2 weeks, I said almost nothing about the house. Mark seemed relieved. He probably thought I was finally giving up. He became cheerful again, started making weekend plans, even talked about taking a vacation after everything settled. Everything, such an interesting word, because I had no intention of letting anything settle. One Thursday evening, Mark walked into the kitchen with a bottle of wine. "I've been thinking," I looked up from my laptop. "About what?" "Maybe we should celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "Our future." I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, "What future?" He smiled. "The one where we finally stop holding on to the past." He still didn't understand. The house wasn't the past. It was the last promise my grandmother ever made to me. The following Monday, Rebecca called. "I have something." "What is it?" "We subpoenaed records related to the financing request." My heart skipped a beat. "And?" "It wasn't for your mother-in-law's house." I closed my eyes. I already knew. "It was for commercial property," she continued. "And Emily?" "There are emails." "What kind of emails?" "Between your husband and the investment group." My stomach tightened. Rebecca read one sentence aloud. "Once my wife signs, the funds will be available immediately." Not if, when. He wasn't hoping I'd agree. He'd already promised them I would. That night, Mark came home smiling. "I've got fantastic news." I looked at him. "What happened?" "The investors accepted my proposal." I nodded. "Congratulations." He blinked. "That's it?" "What else should I say?" "I thought you'd be happy." I smiled politely. "I am." For the first time, I saw uncertainty cross his face. He couldn't read me anymore, and that frightened him, more than any argument ever could. 3 days later, he finally placed the papers on the kitchen table. There it is. I looked down. A sales agreement, prepared, printed, highlighted where I needed to sign. He slid a pen toward me. I already negotiated an amazing price. I picked up the first page, then the second, then the third, very carefully, almost casually. Finally, I looked up. "Mark," he smiled. "Yeah? I have a question." "Sure. Did you really think I'd sign away the only thing my grandmother left me? So you could buy an investment property?" His smile disappeared, completely, for several seconds. Neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, "What are you talking about?" I calmly opened my folder. Inside were copies of every document, every email, every financing request, and I gently placed them on the table between us. "I know everything." Mark stared at the papers, then at me, then back at the papers again. He didn't touch them. For the first time in our marriage, he looked completely lost. "I can explain." I nodded. "I'm sure you can." "It isn't what it looks like." I couldn't help smiling. "Really?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like you plan to use my home to finance your investment." He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "After everything was approved." "So after I signed?" He looked down. "I didn't think you'd understand." That sentence hurt more than all the lies. After 12 years together, he had decided what I deserved to know. He reached for my hand. I quietly pulled it away. "Emily, I was doing this for us." I shook my head. "No. You were doing it for yourself. You bought your mother a beautiful house. You planned a new commercial investment. You made promises to investors. And somehow, the only person expected to sacrifice anything was me." The room fell silent. A few minutes later, he asked, "What happens now?" I had already thought about that. I opened another folder. "This is a postnuptial property agreement." He frowned. "My attorney prepared it. It states that my house will remain my separate property. Forever." He looked stunned. "You hired a lawyer?" "I had to." "Emily, you didn't trust me." I looked at him for a long moment, then quietly answered, "I did. That's why this hurts." He didn't sign, not that day, or the next. Instead, he kept trying to convince me everything could go back to normal. Flowers, apologies, promises, long conversations. For weeks, I listened. But something inside me had changed. Trust doesn't disappear in one dramatic moment. It disappears one small decision at a time. One secret, one lie, one promise made behind your back. Until one day, there's simply nothing left. 3 months later, I moved into the guest room. 2 months after that, I filed for divorce. People kept asking the same question. Was it really about the house? No, it never was. The house simply revealed what our marriage had become. Almost a year later, I drove past the commercial lot Mark had wanted so badly. The land was still empty. The highway project had been delayed indefinitely. The investors had backed out months earlier. Without my house, the deal had collapsed. As for me, I spent that same year restoring my grandmother's home, not because it increased in value, because it deserved to be loved. I planted new roses in the front yard, rebuilt the old porch swing, painted the kitchen the exact shade of cream Grandma always wanted but could never afford. Every room slowly felt like home again, not the home I shared with my husband. My home. One Saturday morning, I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. "Emily, it was Mark. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I looked out at the garden. The roses were finally blooming. For a moment, I remembered the man I'd married, the one who used to make me laugh, the one I believed would always stand beside me. Then I remembered the man who had quietly planned to sell my future without asking. "I'm sorry, too," I said. He sounded surprised. "For what?" "For believing love could survive without respect." Neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "I hope you're happy." I smiled. For the first time in a very long time. "I am." I ended the call, set my phone down, and looked at the little brass key hanging beside my front door. The same key my grandmother had handed me years before she passed away. She used to say, "A home isn't the place that protects your heart. It's the place where you learn to protect it yourself." Back then, I never understood what she meant. Now I finally did. Sometimes, the greatest thing you can save isn't a house, it's yourself.